I'm Angus Montgomery. I'm the editor of Design Week, which is a sort of online industry title for design. And I must make a confession sort of right now, actually. It's probably quite unprofessional, but I'm actually sort of quite intimidated by the panel because they are really serious, you know, proper journalists, and I'm just someone playing at journalism and writing about logos, so I already feel sort of hugely out of my depth already. But to introduce you, so on my left, Abigail Fielding-Smith, who works for the Bureau for Investigative Journalism and is also involved in the Coda project, which is why we're here. And next to her, Natalia Antelava, who is a freelance journalist and co-founder of Coda. And then we also have Tom Warren, who is an investigative reporter at BuzzFeed, not involved in Coda, but has opinions about it, I imagine. And at the end, Melissa Clark, who is client services lead at Method on the Coda project.
And probably admit I'm not a journalist either.
I'm not a journalist, but I'm still hugely intimidated by it.
It's intimidating.
It's mutual. Yeah. It's totally mutual.
So I guess it would be helpful to start out by, well, first of all, describing what Coda is, and also why you felt the need to do it. I mean, why you felt that journalism needed this new platform, needed this thing. So I don't know if you guys want
So it started off. We have also a third co-founder who's not with us here, Ilan Greenberg, but you and I were sort of having discussions, and you were having discussions with Ilan, but basically we're all kind of foreign correspondents who've covered a lot of the hotspots around the world, and we felt that there was a kind of richness and depth to the stories that wasn't getting through. And that wasn't because the people covering them weren't good journalists or that the editors commissioning them weren't good editors, but it was something to do with the sort of structural way that the news agenda is set. And increasingly, you know, as everyone is chasing 24/7 rolling news cycle, there's quite a lot of content. Well, there's an overwhelming amount of content, but actually kind of less diversity of content, weirdly, and less kind of original, interesting stories that kind of get to the depth of what we felt the crises we were covering was actually about. And then maybe Natalia could talk about
and I think it actually the personal story behind it. Abby and I were in Yemen, and I remember so clearly, she was there for the FT, I was there for the BBC. We were covering the uprising in Yemen, and then both of us pulled out the same week, and once we left, having been there for like almost 2 months, and once we left, that was it. Yemen fell off the news agendas because the reporters were not there. We were basically the foreign press in Yemen, and once we were gone, it was so much harder for our editors to bring the story. Not necessarily because they were not interested, but it was so much harder to bring the story to the readers, to the viewers. And I think that's what really got us thinking and got the conversation going about, like, surely there is another way of doing this. I think for me personally in the beginning, it was also, I felt that the way that my employer at the time was approaching the storytelling was basically outdated, because I felt that the digital format, it was still so much focused with the BBC on the radio or on television and translating it into online formats, whereas the biggest pickup, you know, the biggest impact always comes from digital these days. So, and I had this very clear feeling that we, all of us, kind of collectively are underutilizing all the in legacy media organizations, and not only are underusing all the possibilities that the web offers. And as our conversation developed, we came up with the concept of Coda, which basically takes one crisis at a time and covers it for an extended period of time. It stays on the story. That's our tagline.
I was just going to ask, before we move on to how Coda works, I'm interested in exploring a bit more the kind of what you've described as I suppose the failures of traditional media outlets, and why is it they're not staying on the stories long enough? What's going on there? Is it a resource issue? Is it not understanding how stories work? Is it pressure from the audiences? Or
I think it's a combination of all the above. I think it's definitely the resource issue. I think it's the short attention span. I think it's pressure because of the digital, to create as much content as possible, because there is a feeling, you know, I mean, Abby can talk better about that, but we basically are under constant, if you are on a breaking story, you are under constant pressure to be producing your news. And I think every reporter who's covered breaking story will be very familiar, whether used to be the case for the broadcast journalists, but now for newspaper journalists as well, where you actually don't get the time to go and report the story because you're constantly either filing updates or are on air or are, you know, doing your lives or doing something else. So, and the editors, you know, they feel that they need to put the resources on the story of the day. So last week, you know, 2 weeks ago it's Nepal, today, and
I also think that, I mean, in many ways, obviously the fact that there's a huge increase in the number of reporting outlets and the number of voices and everything that like Twitter and social media have done to kind of increase the volume of information and commentary out there is good. But weirdly, I feel, sort of counterintuitively, I feel that that's actually, instead, you'd think that that would make the kind of narrative more challenged and diverse. But actually, weirdly, I think for the editors of like mainstream news organisations, that sort of becomes a cacophony, and they panic about being on the wrong side of it. And actually, like it makes
it's very easy to see what the prevailing attitudes are.
Yeah, you don't want to be missing what seems to be the mood or the story. And so actually, I mean, maybe it was ever thus, I don't know, but I certainly noticed. I mean, I covered like the Syria story for a long while, and it always seemed like, you know, the stories would go in clusters. Like everyone would do a story about this thing from all the different outlets. But, you know, oh, the rebels are winning, or the rebels are losing, or you know, everyone, and there wasn't, it just wasn't as much diversity as I think the story required. And my hunch is that social media kind of amplifies that.
Yeah. And when, listen, so can you tell me a bit about how it worked? I mean, did these guys come to you with this concept? And what was there, and who created what, and how did that sort of process work?
Yeah, so the Coda team approached us because they'd seen we'd done a piece of work for Reuters, which was a wider image project. So it was an app that really took sort of photographic storytelling and really added depth and richness around it. And I think you guys had seen that and thought, okay, this is a team that can kind of help us bring this vision to life. So we had, and the plan was that there was a Global Editors Network conference last year, and what we wanted to do is get to a proof of concept. So is this idea actually a tangible thing that people would engage with, would use and consume? So we had a meeting in London where we all sat down and sort of talked about what the idea would be and what the brand would look like and what the service would look like. And basically over the course of sort of 6 weeks, working remotely while the team were reporting and us being in London, started to kind of really put meat around what the brand was, what their perspective was, and how you translated that into an experience. So,
and I think the main thing that we came to you with, because we knew we wanted to do it, but we obviously didn't know how, and we came to Method with a question, okay, so how do you make design part of the digital storytelling experience? How do you use design as part of the storytelling rather than just the kind of the vehicle for it? How do you create kind of an overarching narrative of a big complex crisis, which includes both that big picture and all the intimate, all the little pieces of the puzzle that creates.
And then because they were coming at it from a sort of design point of view, they asked us questions that we didn't realise we were going to have to, like, if you're not, because, you know, we had this thing that we don't do breaking news, you know, that's how we differentiate ourselves. We don't just, you know, follow the day's news agenda or even the week's news agenda. We want to be distinctive. And then Method said, well, if your organising principle for like collecting and presenting the information isn't what happened latest, then what is it? And we were like, oh, right, good question. And that's when we came up with the idea.
What's it like? I mean, Tom, we were talking earlier about kind of, I suppose, stereotypical views of journalists and stereotypical views of designers. And there's a kind of stereotypical view of a journalist, which, I won't go into, but not necessarily someone who's the most dynamic or kind of forward-thinking, but somebody, you know, it's journalism as a craft, probably, or as an industry, hasn't really progressed an awful lot probably in the last sort of 50 years or so. The way that newspapers are structured, the way they make their money, the way that the editor, reporter kind of dynamic works. Whereas design as an industry changes every, 2 or 3 months, and designers as people are kind of stereotypically, again, much more kind of outward thinking, much more kind of creative. I mean, is this something that you guys found, or Tom, is this something that you kind of...
I mean, this is a subject that I'm really kind of warm to, and we were talking about earlier, where, like in the 90s, this amazing thing happened, the internet, where people anywhere in the world could access any information. And journalism as an industry was like King Canute trying to hold back the tide. We've done this with a pen and a notepad and a printing press for the last 50 years, and we ain't changing. Now, if you'd done that in business, you would have gone to the wall. If you ran a big bank, if you ran a supermarket, and you said, no, computers, they ain't gonna last. It's just not happening. Like, we all know what would happen, but in journalism, people wear it as like a badge of pride. And my work is as a data journalist, so I work a lot with coders as well. The marriage of kind of technology and journalism can really achieve wonderful things, especially when, like with foreign correspondency, where the funding isn't always there. I look at the local press, there are people I hugely respect working 70, 80 hours a week for like money that they can't even bring their families up on, because the industry is struggling. So we have to look at different ways of doing it. And I think, especially with regards to foreign correspondency, that's where it really matters. But what you guys do, I'm always in awe of, because it's like the pinnacle of the industry.
Yeah.
I think on that point, I feel terribly guilty as as working as a design studio. I come to this lovely office, I've got lovely cafes and restaurants around me, and you get kind of sucked into this bubble. And when Coda kind of walked in, and sort of me and the two design team that sort of worked on it, and I think Natalia's first opening story was like, oh yeah, I've just flown to Ukraine, and yesterday someone had a gun to my head and marched me up to this apartment block and demanded that I tell them who I was interviewing. And you're kind of sitting there and like, most new clients just want an app or something like that. And you're just, and normally you're just trying to talk to them and be like, oh God, please not another app, or please not another infographic, or just, let's actually, let's actually do something really compelling and really powerful. And I suppose for all three of us, we just kind of sat there and went, holy fuck, and you're sitting on our couch, we're having dishoom, and talking really normally, like if Coda was music, what would it be? And, obviously other important questions as well. But I think kind of what really struck a chord, and I think why, we did this sort of around our jobs, was that I think all of us kind of felt this sort of almost like this kind of really guilty luxury and this need to really check our privilege that we had, and that actually that we had become, and not that I want to point fingers at anybody, I think in some ways, I have to take responsibility for that, but had maybe kind of become disconnected with communities that were suffering quite intense crisis situations, and I had absolutely no idea what was happening on the ground and how people were experiencing different situations. And I think to be able to kind of bring something to that, have the opportunity to bring something like that to life, was something I just don't think you could ignore, even just on a personal and a moral level. So.
And did you guys kind of feel, when you're working with Method, or when you're working with a design studio, I suppose that this is different from working? I mean, is this something you could have done in a traditional media environment? Could you have gone to a product development person there and said, we want to do this, or
we don't have product development.
Yeah, exactly. Or whoever that might be.
No, I can't imagine anyone sitting down and saying, if your approach to reporting was a type of bird, what type of bird would it be? That scenario doesn't happen. No, I mean, what I think was amazing, it was genuinely a collaboration in that I feel that, as I was saying earlier, the design actually changed the way we thought about a journalistic approach, and the concept of currents that we came up with. And I think it was very much like a fusion of the two.
Yeah, and I think it emphasized the importance of. I mean, I'm realizing we haven't explained the currents, or really what Coda is.
Could you just explain
But I think what it really emphasized is, the way you did television with a cameraman and a soundman back in the day. And this is how you should be doing the digital journalism with a coder and a designer. And this is hardly a revelation. I mean, more and more of it is being done, but I think still not enough in the legacy legacy media organizations for sure, where you actually have to work as a team, because what we came up with it. So as Abby said, the question was, so if it's not the latest, then what? If you're not following the latest news, then what are you following? And what we came up with is the thematic dissection of any crisis that we're following, where within each crisis we identify the main themes, and every piece of content lives in one of these themes, which we call currents. And that becomes and that's what kind of gives, and the overview of all the currents is what gives you the overview of a crisis or an issue that we're covering. So that's what the current is, and I don't think we would have come up with it without the design. It's very much design driven.
Yeah.
But also, I mean, we had the luxury to experiment, and this has always been about experimenting, and we're not first and foremost trying to create a digital product that can generate a certain number of hits per day or whatever. Our principle has been like, let's try and think of the thing that most expresses what we want to do, editorially and design-wise, and then use that as kind of leverage for the commercial things further down the line, rather than
Because how will that commercial model work then? Because it's interesting. I mean, the prevailing model for journalism, for digital journalism, is get as many hits, get as many fucking people on this site. We don't really care who they are. We just want a massive, massive bit of traffic, and then we can take those really impressive figures to to potential clients and sell them advertising. And in doing that, I mean, that kind of works for some people, but I think you kind of almost said it yourself. In doing that, you create an almost hamster wheel, because you have to constantly update with content. You have to constantly do loads and loads of breaking stories to attract this massive audience. When you start doing that, it's very intensive. It's very hard to kind of take your mind away from it and think about how could we be doing this better. And what you're doing is almost, you've managed to break away from that. And I'm interested in, kind of explained how you've done it, but how you think you're going to develop it, and how that's going to work commercially. How that will.
Should I? Well, the basic concept is that each Coda story, Coda it's a single issue crisis reporting platform. So we take one crisis at a time, and eventually we want to be running several at a time, but essentially each one of them gets its dedicated web page or mobile app where there's nothing, you go on it and there's nothing but Syria or but Ukraine or economic crisis, financial crisis, or a housing crisis in London, and so on. It can be a number of different issues. So eventually we want to expand it, but it's kind of the vertical growth. Yeah. And of course, this means that each of them will have a niche audience, which is actually very much tailored to the current sort of trend, because I think we as we were talking about it earlier, we're all becoming more and more local in a sense in our news consumption, except local these days means what interests us rather than the geographic area. We all read things that we want to read, that we're interested in. We no longer go to home pages. We get stuff off Twitter and social media and so on. So by definition, our audience around each Coda story is small, and we don't necessarily, we want to, with the emphasis on quality of reporting and quality of storytelling, we want to attract outsiders who want quality journalism, but we also very much want to build communities around the crisis that we're covering. In terms of the revenue, our revenue model is diverse. The journalism part of Coda, it will be non-profit, which will allow us to go for philanthropic, for grants and so on. But it's basically the licensing model. So we want to use the model for corporate storytelling, for anyone who wants to explain complex issues and crises.
Yeah. Okay, cool. I'm interested you kind of mentioned this idea of niche and local, and that being something that people are very interested in at the moment. I'm kind of interested in that because that's when the internet first started. I think that's how a lot of journalists saw it. Like, local news outlets were really, really big, 15 years ago. And then it kind of shifted, and they kind of all moved, and then it became the big kind of, it became the Daily Mail, it became the Guardian, it became the really high traffic sites. And do you think it's moving back to that now? Do you think there's a kind of breakup of the bigger, or BuzzFeed even?
I think
do you think that that's, as a site which has a ridiculous amount of traffic and is hugely popular, do you kind of, as BuzzFeed, feel the pressure now to be more local, to be...
I think for us, we're in an unusual position because we have so much traffic and we don't have an editorial policy. It's don't tell, show. Got it out there. Where essentially we can find an audience for anything, which is often really heartening. I mean, people will write a story, the marriage referendum in Ireland, and I mean that was a huge story internationally, but the way that people interacted with it and read it from all over the world, you look at the comments, everybody's fascinated in everything, and everything on the internet finds a home, people can find what they want. And I think especially with kind of conflict or foreign reporting, so many people who have that interest.
But I think it's the definition of local has changed. Local is no longer a geographical location. Local is what your interest is.
Yeah, and just by virtue of being on the internet, like people will, and once they find it, they don't leave, because they go to your site and they think that was really interesting.
Do you think that's an element of it being local, or it just being a good story that touches, whether that's something mentally...
I mean, every now and then there will be a story which, whatever sphere produced it, will just be so compelling that it will be read by a wide audience, and our aim is to do those kind of stories with Coda as well, but also, we recognise that not everyone necessarily wants to follow two characters on opposite sides of the Ukrainian conflict in depth for like 6 months, but there are people that do, and they're scattered across the world, and it wouldn't make sense for like a print outlet to try and reach them, but digitally you can reach them, and people who want that kind of depth and engagement.
So the zombie story. This is my favourite my favourite thing in journalism. A load of money is made from stories from 2008 and 2009, and for whatever reason, everybody
they
will
get
just
on Twitter again.
Everybody will just Google James Brown funeral all at the same time, and that would become one of the most read stories on the Guardian. So like the idea that journalism has to be necessarily time sensitive. A newspaper is time sensitive because in 36 hours time someone's going to be wrapping fish and chips in it. Okay? With the internet, anybody who wants to learn something about this, you can read that news story from 2008, 2009.
But and that's also why it's really important to use the technology and design as part of the storytelling, because in the old days when it is the story on the paper, you got to get it all in there. With a story that's online, if you design it in the right way, it doesn't have to have all the basic information that you don't need to get all the basic facts in there necessarily. You can have them somewhere else, or you can have pieces that complement it there.
That's why I find the channels idea really interesting, because you're almost creating something that, as someone who kind of runs a design news website, our archive is a total fucking mess. Like, I can't do anything with it. It's all like, they're great stories, obviously, I think, but I can't curate them in any way. I can't really link them up properly, not without, a hugely intensive process. But by creating these channels, you're almost creating archives. You're creating a permanently existing story, and you're thinking about journalism in a way that online titles aren't, because they're still, they're still thinking about it as tomorrow's chip paper. Like, we will still publish a story and it will get most of its traffic on that day or on the day after, and then it will kind of disappear and you almost forget about it. But it's still there, it's still huge, and there are still people reading it, and it still could be hugely valuable and important. Yeah,
I mean, our ultimate aim is for, when, as we do a deployment and as we report stories and the currents become fuller and fuller, and I guess some of them will intensify over time and some of them will wane off, and then the idea is that when we eventually stop doing that deployment, the currents will act as a kind of commentary on what that crisis was, or what that crisis was at that phase, and by looking at it, it's almost like a kind of meta story in itself.
How do you, if I can sort of continue this conversation about commercialising and commercialising journalism in general, because you're describing something that is predicated on really, really rigorous objective journalism, and how do you defend that in a kind of commercial environment where you have to use it to make money? And this is a question, I suppose, for all of you as well, because it's a question we all face.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, you know, we like everyone, we're going to be experimenting to a degree, and I think obviously having philanthropic funding for some of it is going, particularly in the early stages as we're establishing ourselves and our model, is going to be important. But yeah, I mean, I think, as Natalia mentioned, the possibility of licensing the model, the storytelling model, particularly at a time when there's kind of, as we were talking about earlier, like brands wanting to kind of raise awareness are starting to kind of want to do it in more innovative ways, and there's a kind of, obviously Melissa could probably talk more about this, but there's like a parallel set of questions I think being asked in the advertising industry about how to change formats and models for the digital age. And then also another thing which we haven't mentioned before, but you know, the point of building up this like dedicated audience and really engaged audience is that maybe not necessarily through advertising, but through other ways you can kind of leverage that. I mean, for example, one of the people that do this well is a paper called is it the Texas Tribune that we were talking about? And they like basically a kind of investigative paper in the US. I don't actually know if they are a paper, if they're digital only. Anyway, but they do like a lot of events, they do conferences, they do, they've just come up with lots of kind of interesting and innovative ways to kind of leverage the fact that people really support the work they do and are really engaged with it. So,
Yeah, but I mean, advertisement is definitely sort of the big theme, and you know, as advertisement online becomes, you know, it doesn't pay enough, it's not really working, which is why we entertained the idea of using advertisement, and then we decided not to, and we decided not to because we decided that we were not going to make enough money from it anyway. But where there is interest and there is money, there seems to be, or we hope there is the, you know, is kind of the full package, the content. You know, everyone wants to produce content, and obviously there has to be a separation between journalism and the commercial side, but you know, we believe it's a much better way of doing it than, for example, I mean, and this is not against the Guardian, but the Guardian's entire development coverage is paid for by the Gates Foundation. It's embedded in the paper. You can't really tell whether it's, you know, I mean, you have to look for it to know. So, but you can also create the content for the, you know, for the Gates Foundation, which is not, and create a much clearer separation.
I was laughing because we had a conversation earlier, and I said, "Oh, why don't you sell one of your currents?" And Abby looked at me with just such disgust. She's like, "No, the line."
I said, "Why don't you sell one of the currents to Shell?"
No. Okay, there was some context.
But I mean, Melissa, just on this idea of kind of clients or commercial partners creating content and needing to do, I think there's, you know, I feel there's a kind of, like most media organisations are kind of going, we'd love it if clients did something a bit more interesting with us instead of just buying display, or instead of just using a banner and a skyscraper, or alternatively instead of just trying to buy coverage, because that's a lot of what it is. So do you think that clients and advertisers can be a bit more creative about what they do? Do you think there are ways that?
I completely. I think it's twofold. I think that it's appreciating how hard it is to create really good quality content, you know, and I think respecting that, and if needed, you know, taking an approach like The Economist has done, which is basically making it a subscription only, or it's working with publishers in I think a slightly more refreshing way than just your skyscraper and on your banner, by, you know, helping them. I think they need, because I think for any publisher it's working with them to be more content led. So rather than your kind of sort of classical, you know, just push stuff out there and kind of almost like bombard someone with a message, it's like, how can you bring someone into a conversation? And I think there's not many, but I think there are brands. I think Red Bull would be a really good example, but there are other brands that are actually creating content, and I think there's a need to find niches which people will pay for, because I think people aren't paying for mass news anymore. And I also think there's an opportunity, it's not the content that you're creating, but it's the opportunity to commercialise the community that you're creating around that content. But it just requires taking a risk and also accepting that some stuff is going to work and some stuff is not going to work, and you just have to move on. But I appreciate there's a traditional media organisation that has spent you know, the last 100 years either selling kind of, you know, a section of a page layout, and then in some ways has just taken that same model and put it online. That's a really, really big shift.
It's a bit. I think the difficulty is that was a really easy model. It made loads of people loads and loads of money, and then you know, and people still can't accept that it's not working anymore, and it requires.
I don't see how you can't. I mean, Facebook have just launched their instant articles, which, I mean, I personally think, I read this press release and Facebook were like, oh, and we've carefully selected these media organisations to come and be part of our platform. And I'm like, well, of course you have, you know, because the online reality show Facebook has now started to wane, because, you know, how many times can you look at the picture of someone's dog or someone's baby? And now they've obviously got to have content, because you're essentially what they're selling to their advertisers is attention. So now they need to bring content onto their platform. So of course it makes complete sense for them to then want media organisations to then
really
put their content on their website. So it becomes a platform which you'll never leave, which I think is really quite scary. And it strikes me almost that a lot of media organisations need to almost kind of just dig their heels in and say, kind of absolutely not. Like, there's a difference between wanting to be where your audiences are versus actually sticking your content there and then kind of losing complete control of your brand and how you want to tell certain stories and essentially educate and take your audiences on a journey. So please don't stick your stuff on instant.
We wanted to open up to some questions from the audience as well. So I don't know, is there a mic, or people could just put their hands up and shout? That would be fabulous. In the front row.
Can I ask Tom about design and BuzzFeed? And I take my hat off to you because there was a piece running during the election about the Conservatives' budget plans, which felt terrifyingly un-BuzzFeed, but it was a fabulous mixed media offering of graphics and pictures and not too much text. And you used the phrase "don't tell, show," which I'm freely about, I hadn't heard before. Forgive me. But when you're thinking about your stories, are you also thinking about how is this going to look, or are you then going to designers and saying, look, this is my story, how are we going to make this sing?
I'm going to have to slightly speak tangentially because we work on such long time frames. But we are thinking, how can we make stories sing, especially for big set pieces. We want to use technology to present it differently. In my old job, I did a lot of online production work, where I used a tool called Creativist, which interestingly also pays for journalism. They sell it as a product, and they do some amazing journalism off the back of it. I think the thing with the web is, and people always forget this, is that like with paper, like you can fold it up, you can do origami, but it is just what it is. But with the web page, it's just software. So you can do all these magical things, and it's like people don't ever want to consider that. You know, it's that traditional model of like, let's have the banner ad. We've been doing it 100 years, the model ain't broke. Right? It's like the model is it's a bit rough around the edges. So yeah, I think everything online you have to consider very, very carefully.
Sorry, I can just pick something up because I've got a bit of a bugbear about this, because I used to be a sub-editor, and I think that because in print there are these people called sub-editors who effectively are journalists who also think in design terms, who can create pages, who can take a story and they can make it really work, but that's because they understand what that story is. I don't think that there's that equivalent person online yet, and I think at BuzzFeed you probably have people like that, but I'm constantly like, my team is just reporters, and they're great reporters, but sometimes you kind of feel like you don't know how the story's working, you don't really know what it looks like, you haven't even looked at it properly, and it's a really difficult skill to have that, and you need that person who is a journalist, who really understands the story, but absolutely understands like can visualize it, and knows what's it going to look like, what image is going to work, what chart's going to work, what data's going to work. It's really fucking hard to get those people.
It's so hard, and strangely, I mean, we have at work a really interesting ecosystem where they bring people in just because they're funny on the internet. And they sit on the Buzz team and they write lists, and then they do a news story, so they come and work with the journalists. And then, like, some of these people, they're genius, but they're so immersed. I mean, obviously, like, I'm a geek. I'm a data journalist, you know, like, I go home and code and do terrible, sad things. So I'm like immersed in web culture. I love it, you know. If somebody references me something off a 4chan message board, I kind of get it. But not necessarily, you know, but you know what I mean? Like, we all know the internet. The issue being that, like, loads of people just kind of don't. So you'll see them produce pages, and you're like, you can't put that image there. It's not wrong. It looks like this is like Web 1.0. This is like we're not still using message boards, you know. Whereas sometimes you get these 21-year-old kids who just sit down in front of a computer and they just get it. And you know, it's such a really exciting thing. It's kind of an exciting time to be a journalist, and like.
Sorry, to come back to the design point and the journalism point. Is there, for you, is there a story you think, God, it's just going to be too dull on your, you know, in design terms, I just, you know, I can't make this sing on the page, or is it fine, you know, this won't be as crazy as the other one, but, I mean, how does it, is there anything there?
Do you know, I don't really understand how it, like, this is a truthful and honest answer. Because it's half, you know, and I've only been there for a month. I'm not steeped in the culture, but it's fundamentally different from a traditional newsroom because it's half a tech company. So in a newsroom, you go to your editor and you say, "I want to tell this story of like horrendous human plight," and they're like, "Where is it?" And you're like, "Well, I'm going to have to take a plane." They're like, "No, we just ain't going to expense it," or I don't understand the logistics of this, you know. Everything you sell into an editor, it has to be like this polished product all the time, otherwise you know they're going to knock you back. Whereas here it's like Google, where you just go, you're like, I think I could do this thing, and they're like, okay, there's a coder in the corner, I'm going to talk to the graphic designer and just build it. And I think that's, you know, again, it's that King Canute thing where we do, journalism does need to learn from other industries. We need to develop products. We understand the journalism. We also need to understand the internet, we need to understand commercialism, because I don't think any of us want to be, anyone who's a working journalist, you don't want to be the one standing there playing the violin, chairs are sliding against the water, do you know what I mean? Like, that's not a good place to be for anyone. So, you know, like, so we should look at like the exciting data stuff they do at The Guardian or product development at the Financial Times or BuzzFeed. You know, I think we should all look at it and take it really seriously. It kind of matters, and because it's odd, because the journalism connects to print production. So I'll code a scraper to get financial data from companies that will then map, and that's print production. You merge the two. You know, so it's like, and I think, I mean, you guys must have found this, but like, business savvy is so important, because if you like, I love creativist, and it's like. I don't know, like, it's almost like as a journalist you talk about money and people look at you like you've like said something. I spoke to a journalist once about how you could sell infographics and monetize them, and he looked at me and went, "I don't talk about the money, that's what business do." And I was like, dude, who do you think pays your wages? Like, do you eat air? Like, how do you exist? This is the real world. And I think that consciousness, like the commercial end of journalism, people need to get more and more savvy with it, you know, because it's happening. You know, we've all got to, we should profit from it, not sit there and watch the industry. Do you know what I mean? You know?
Are there any more? Sorry, question in the second row.
I wanted to ask you guys, so once you stop covering a story because it's come to the end, and then what happens if something really big happens in that story or in that place, like the government, you know, something so big that that story is really incomplete without it? I mean, are you going to go back and go, okay guys, actually we are going to change this one, or would you just leave it, and if you just left it, would you expect that people would still read it, or would you just think, you know, that had its life and it's over now?
I think it's a really good question, but I think it's kind of an equivalent to like what happens if you worked on an article, magazine article for 3 months and it got published and then something really big happened. Well, you know, it happened. I think there is an arbitrary end to every piece of journalism in general, so I don't think there is no problem problem in having an arbitrary end, but we are talking about various possibilities for like what happens to Coda after that 1 year is over, or 9 months, or however long we're in the place. And we are talking about a possibility of putting a paywall and continuing, or continuing with a couple of currents and leaving the rest, or just turning it into a, so there is a flexibility. But I think, if there is no money to carry on, or if there are no resources to carry on, we are assuming that the crisis will still be going on when we leave, and you'll just have to leave it.
The assumption that the readers would come while you were covering it for that year.
Yeah. So Philip O'Dwyer, who worked with us from Method on the design, did the presentation with Natalia at the Barcelona conference, put it really well in terms of like the arbitrariness, because as Natalia says, it is quite arbitrary. And he said, yeah, I mean, I guess if you just follow one story for a year really closely, in a way it doesn't matter what it is, but the act of following something closely for a year kind of helps you understand the whole world. Yeah. And like, I think there's almost like, you can almost embrace the arbitrary. Like we're not attempting to be like the authoritative, last word statement on a conflict, the way that like a book published 5 years later would be, or the BBC archives index would be, but it's like a kind of detailed exploration of it for that particular time period.
Which fundamentally is journalism. I mean, that's the definition of what journalism ought to be.
You're right, though. We would be pretty gutted if we just finished it and then a massive thing.
I think even a bigger difficulty will be sort of focusing on Ukraine, and then some like massive story happens somewhere else, and I think that will come the real test of us. As
the mainstream media heard.
We're sticking to the story that no one else is interested in.
Staying on the story.
It's a question in the second row there.
So how do you, thinking about events like the Arab Spring and others, where citizen journalism and essentially user-generated content began to form a core of the news journalism and coverage around those issues. I mean, how does Coda or some of these platforms actually somehow, does it welcome or sort of involve any of that as well? Or?
Well, I mean, it's such a huge part. I mean, say with the Syria conflict, the fact that it is the most videoed and filmed conflict of all time is a huge part. You can't understand the Syria conflict without engaging with that. I don't think we would engage with that in the form of like creating a platform for user-generated content on our website. Everything that we do is kind of commissioned, originally reported, kind of edited, archived journalism. But absolutely, that we would have to find like a creative way to engage with that. I mean, one thing that we were talking about, what was your brilliant idea with like the Twitter and sort of giving people...
We can't give it away.
We have to get you all to sign non-disclosure agreements.
But we are thinking very hard about bringing, because what happens with the social media in general is that it creates another bubble. So, and you are on Twitter and you're thinking you know everything, but it's actually also a bubble of this, like a certain number of people who are tweeting. What we want to do is burst the bubble and bring the voices into it that are not otherwise on it, and we're exploring various ways of doing it. What we're not going to be doing, we're not going to be giving cameras to a bunch of youth activists to go and film us stuff and bring it back, because we want curated, sort of edited, curated content. And I think one of the problems with the Arab Spring and with the internet in general is the just amount of stuff that you're getting, and you want a place that you can come to and it's like that one place where you really find out what's, where you get the bigger picture and where you get the context, rather than, can we trust this guy, or can we, is that real, or is that this real, and so on. So we're not going to be using the citizen journalists in a traditional way, that at least. I mean, there may be ways.
Maybe, you need to help out with figuring out how somehow to make sense out of that avalanche of social media on the one hand, and how that can itself help maybe feed some of the currents and looking at.
Yeah, and we're definitely looking at that. And we're also looking at how we can use the, because there are single subject websites that focus on like one place at a time. There is a thing called, for example, Syria Deeply, which follows the Syria crisis, but what they do is mostly they aggregate, so they pull content from the other sites. The problem is, you know, we're talking about issues that we want to cover after a lot of the mainstream have left, because we believe the story isn't over and we're missing it. So if everyone's left, then what are you aggregating, right? So our focus is on the ground reporting. But as a platform for, you know, as we license it, it can also be used for aggregation.
But I mean, also I do think, we were talking about this earlier actually, I mean, I think there's appetite for stuff as well, which isn't, I mean, you can't ignore all of that stuff that's happening. That's got to feed your reporting, and often, you know, you might want to make that the subject of your reporting. But there is, we recently we talked about Coda at this conference run by the Form Foundation in New York in January, where there was lots of sort of media entrepreneurs, and this theme that emerged over and over again at this conference was that what people were hearing from their
Sorry,
so the title of this is Rethinking Storytelling Platforms, and so we've talked a lot about storytelling and rethinking. What about the platform? You talked a bit about how the design process helped you sort of clarify your vision. In terms of the implementation, the practicalities of design, from what I'm hearing, it's the sort of channel idea, rather than, you know, sort of staccato stories or whatever. So what about the platform is supporting that? Well, I'm sorry, but not in a sort of design sense, right?
Yeah.
So what sort of design, you know,
Yeah, can I add to your question?
Yes,
You're asking how does the website leverage kind of the best aspects of what you're doing? How is it successfully answering to the design?
Right. Yeah. Well, so exactly. So how is design helping the idea of a channel, right? So
We could bring a laptop.
I'm sorry, I guess that. But yeah, so
does that answer it?
So I guess the big sort of theoretical breakthrough is the idea of the channel, right? And so the design is the visualization of these channels, I suppose. Just a micro follow-up. So do you expect other sort of news organizations to pick up on the channel idea and the visualization idea?
Instance for Coda, the currents was the right mechanism and the right format to bring that story to life, and to be able to give the reader a way of being able to see a macro view of how the crisis unfolds, but then be able to drill down in different aspects of it. For some news organisations, you know, a different format might be relevant. You know, it could be just pure audio, or it could be, you know, an infographic. I think it's really got to be down to what the perspective of that business is and their editorial vision and how they drive that through. I think I'd be very cautious about trying to take one format and shoehorn that into a different organisation when it simply doesn't work.
And it also works with our whole concept of staying on a particular story.
Any organisation could do a thematic organisational principle, but you need to kind of be that embedded in the story to actually make it work, to be able to populate it enough to make it work.
But in cash terms, like, because like all newspaper sites are basically big databases. So like, just from what you were saying, if you went to like a news organisation and said, okay, so you've got a serious section, but you've got subheads within it to use your technology, so they can basically visualise their whole like storytelling, and you could charge them a lot of money for it.
Newspapers have so much cash.
I mean, on that point, like John Henley, he's a features editor at The Guardian, and he decided to go to he ran a blog piece called Grease on the Breadline, and he used Twitter as a journalistic tool, but used it to completely power his entire trip. So he essentially kind of put out there, I'm going to Greece, does anyone have a story that they want to tell? So he made the community part of the story, but I think it doesn't replace his skill and his ability to create that narrative. And, you know, I can only admire good writers because because it is a skill, but what using Twitter allowed people to do was be able to say, look, this is really important. It's a chance for the Greece and the community to tell the rest of the world things aren't as they are, but he was able to then bring them into it and use the blog as a mechanism to tell different issues, such as the fact that HIV and malaria has increased as a result of the economic problems there, or that theatres are selling tickets for food, and it's in some ways similar to Coda in the sense that it's kind of like a never-ending story, and that that things happen after kind of these big kind of meetings where they decide they're going to give more money, but he didn't use currents to do that. He just used the mechanism of a blog and different article pieces.
We should totally copy that.
Yeah,
I love it.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to apply the arbitrary rules of journalism and deciding when a story has to end. I'm afraid the story has to end. So thank you all very much for coming, and thank you so much to our panel, to Abigail and Natalia, to Tom and to Melissa as well. And thank you very much.